advantage. Any factor that increases your winning chances is an advantage. The player who has the most such factors in his or her favor has the advantage in the game. That is, the better winning chances. Specific advantages fall into categories. For instance, if you have fewer weaknesses than your opponent, you probably have an advantage in pawn structure. In Diagram 1, since white's pawns are in fewer groups than black's, they are easier to guard. Black's pawns have more weaknesses. Time. If you have more pieces developed than your opponent, you probably have an advantage in time. White has a large edge in development in Diagram 2. White has a big edge in time. Note that white has one less pawn than black. In order to capture the white b-pawn, black wasted valuable time and moved the queen several times. As a result, black now has only 3 developed pieces, while white's 7 pieces are all in action. This gives white a winning superiority in time. Space. Control of the center, more advanced pawns, rooks on open and half-open files, these are some indicators of an advantage in space. In Diagram 3, white's spatial edge is significant. Material. If you have more men or more valuable men than your opponent, you have an advantage in material. In Diagram 4, white has an extra pawn but black has a rook compared with white's knight. Black therefore has a slight material advantage. Safety. If your king is less exposed than your opponent's, you probably have an advantage in king safety. In Diagram 5, white's king is securely castled. Black's is stuck in the center and dangerously exposed. White's king is safer than black's. Types of advantages. Advantages can be temporal, positional, or material. Temporal advantages might include faster piece development or having been able to force your opponent to make extra pawn moves instead of developing pieces. Temporal advantages have a way of evaporating, so they should be converted to other types of advantages early in the game. Your opponent will be able to catch up in development, for example, if you don't make something of your early development soon enough. Positional advantages, such as control of the center, good pawn structure, controlling open or half-open files, and obtaining a safe position for the king, change constantly throughout the game. When you play positionally, you are trying for small advantages, and sometimes your opponent either doesn't realize what you are doing or doesn't consider those advantages important. But although those little advantages may not amount to much individually, when they're accumulated and cultivated, they can eventually add up to a real positional superiority. To neutralize these advantages, your opponent may have to surrender material or submit to a strong attack on his king. Material advantages, such as trading a knight for a rook, or a queen for 2 minor pieces, keeping a good bishop, or trading a bad bishop, are usually the most decisive. Advantages in material and pawn structure tend to be more permanent than temporal advantages. If you have an extra pawn, unless something radical happens, you will probably still have it 10 moves later. Thus, some advantages are more useful, practically speaking, while others are harder to turn into a win. Analyzing the competition positionally, try to build your game and increase your overall advantages. Reduce the weaknesses in your own position and increase those in your opponent's. To do this, you must be able to evaluate correctly. You must know how to analyze a chess position. Analysis. Analyzing a chess position is like making a mental tally sheet of the weaknesses and strengths for each side. You determine the game's character and potential by imagining possible moves and responses, by looking for your opponent's threats and finding threats of your own. While playing, divide the analytic process into 2 sections. When it is your move, be concrete and specific. When it is your opponent's move, let your mind wander over the board, and ask yourself general questions about the position. Questions are the key. The key is to ask questions. Suppose your opponent has just played and now it's your move. You must analyze specifically and directly. First, you might ask, what does my opponent's move threaten? Are any of my pieces or pawns attacked and threatened? If so, are they adequately protected? If they aren't, what can I do to safeguard them? If a piece is threatened, probe the position to determine whether You should guard your piece, move it to safety, or trade it for an enemy unit of equal value. Perhaps you can negate the threat by making a more significant threat of your own. Don't ignore enemy threats, but be careful. If you try to meet your opponent's threat by making a threat of your own, and your opponent is able to defend 18 against your threat with an additional threat, you will then be faced with 2 threats on the next move. It might not be possible for you to meet both of them. For example, in diagram 6, black could make a terrible blunder. Black should move the threatened knight. Black should simply move the knight to safety. But what if black, seeing the possibility of inserting a check at f4 with his bishop, decides to postpone dealing with the threat for one move? See diagram 7. Black thinks that white must deal with this check and therefore can carry out the threat to the knight. But white answers the check by blocking it with the e3 pawn. Suddenly black is faced with 2 threats, the original one to the knight and the new one to the bishop. Black will lose a piece on the next move. Black's blunder costs a piece, not threatened. If you determine that your opponent poses no threats, then do some threatening of your own. Generally, you will want to threaten your opponent without risking your own game. You will also want to build your potential for future attack. You should not threaten just to threaten. To some extent, your analysis will be based on what has gone before. Determine whether your previous threats have been met by your opponent's last move. If your opponent answered your last threat with a new threat of his own, decide which threat is more serious before choosing your next move. Waiting for the move. While you are waiting for your opponent to move, you probably won't have to prepare an answer to an immediate threat, since you don't know what your opponent's going to play. Maybe there won't even be a threat. But it's a good time to ask yourself general questions to fill out your picture of the position. Does the enemy have any weaknesses? Given the opportunity, how could they be exploited? What are the enemy's strengths? Are there any potential threats the enemy can generate? What are my weaknesses? Can I get rid of them? Can I compensate for them? Develop your system. It isn't necessary to ask these specific questions. You may compose your own questions that may be more effective for you. The point is to develop your knowledge of the position by asking yourself questions and answering them. That's the way to analyze a chess position. Once you're involved in a game, you may be able to draw upon your previous considerations to facilitate and expedite your analysis. You don't have to repeat the analysis on every move. 7. But remember that the purpose of analysis is to determine a course of action. First analyze the position, then make a plan or decide on your next move. You can't plan for the future if you don't know where you stand now.